There is a fundamental rule in warfare. Never fight an enemy who has nothing to lose. But what do you do when the enemy isn't just fearless? What do you do when the enemy has actively convinced the world that he is a demon? In the year 1718, the Atlantic Ocean belonged to one man. His name was Edward Thatch, but the world knew him simply as Blackbeard. He wasn't just a pirate. He was an absolute master of psychological warfare. He tied slow-burning fuses into his massive beard, stepping onto the decks of captured ships wreathed in fire and sulfur. He blockaded the entire colonial capital of Charleston, South Carolina, holding the city hostage just to demand a chest of medicine. He commanded a converted slave ship called Queen Anne's Revenge, carrying 40 cannons, more firepower than the naval frigates sent to hunt him. He was, by all accounts, untouchable. But by the fall of 1718, Blackbeard had lost his flagship. Queen Anne's Revenge had run aground on a sandbar in North Carolina. Stripped of his massive floating fortress, Blackbeard downsized. He took a pardon from a corrupt local governor, kept a smaller, faster sloop called Adventure, and essentially retired to the shallow, treacherous inlets of the Outer Banks. He thought he was safe. The waters of Ocracoke Inlet were too shallow for massive British warships to enter. Any heavy frigate that tried to sail in and arrest him would rip its hull open on the sandbars. Blackbeard had found the perfect pirate sanctuary, but he underestimated the sheer stubborn will of the governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, and more importantly, he underestimated the man Spotswood hired to do the impossible. Governor Spotswood had watched Blackbeard terrorize the coast for long enough. He knew he couldn't send standard warships. So, he devised a plan that bordered on madness. He would send men, not heavy ships, not massive cannons. Just men, packed into tiny, unarmored sloops, to sail directly into Blackbeard's stronghold. The man chosen to lead this mission was a 34-year-old first lieutenant of the Royal Navy named Robert Maynard. History has largely forgotten Robert Maynard. But on November 22, 1718, he walked into the jaws of hell, and he did it without a single cannon. To understand the sheer insanity of Maynard's mission, you have to understand the ships he was given. Maynard was temporarily given command of 2 civilian sloops, named the Jane and the Ranger. These were not warships. They were essentially glorified delivery boats, because they had to navigate the incredibly shallow waters of the North Carolina coast. They could not carry heavy artillery. Let me repeat that. They had no large cannons. Maynard's primary ship, the Jane, had about 35 men. The Ranger had about 25. They were armed only with personal weapons, muskets, pistols, swords, and pure naval discipline. Their target, Blackbeard's sloop Adventure, was anchored in Ocracoke Inlet. While Adventure was smaller than Queen Anne's Revenge, it was still a dedicated pirate vessel, heavily armed with cannons loaded with grape shot, a devastating scattershot of iron balls, nails, and glass designed to shred human flesh at close range. Lieutenant Maynard was a professional. He knew exactly what this was. If they were spotted too early, Blackbeard's cannons would tear his unarmored wooden boats to splinters before they could even get close enough to fire a musket. Their only advantage was the element of surprise and the brutal efficiency of Royal Navy close-quarters combat. On November 17, 1718, Maynard and his 60 men set sail from Virginia, creeping slowly down the coastline. They traveled without naval colors, disguising themselves as ordinary merchant vessels. For 4 days, they navigated the brutal, freezing November winds of the Atlantic, and on the evening of November 21st, they finally spotted it, the masts of the Adventure, anchored just inside Ocracoke Inlet. Maynard gave the order to drop anchor. The sun was setting. They would wait for dawn. The night of November 21st is one of the most fascinating psychological moments in the history of piracy. Maynard and his men sat in utter silence in the freezing dark. No fires were lit. No one spoke above a whisper. They spent the night checking their flintlocks, sharpening their cutlasses, and making peace with whatever god they prayed to. They were mere hundreds of yards away from the deadliest man on the ocean. But across the water, on the Adventure, things were very different. Blackbeard knew they were there. He had been tipped off by local sympathizers that an expedition was coming for him. He saw the two sloops anchor at the mouth of the inlet. He knew exactly who was on those ships, and yet Blackbeard didn't flee under the cover of darkness. He didn't mount a preemptive strike. Instead, according to survivor accounts, he stayed up all night drinking heavily with his crew and a local merchant. Why? Was it arrogance? Was it the hubris of a man who had never been defeated? Or was it something darker? Blackbeard was a highly intelligent operator. He knew the golden age of piracy was ending. The pardons were running out. The British Empire was closing its grip on the Atlantic. Perhaps as he drank rum in his cabin that cold November night, Edward Thatch decided he was done running. If he was going to die, he was going to die exactly as he lived, in a storm of fire and blood on his own terms. At one point during the night, one of his crewmen asked him a chilling question. If he died in the coming battle, did his wife know where he had buried his treasure? Blackbeard reportedly laughed and replied, "Nobody but the devil and myself knows where it is, and the longest liver shall take all." As the first light of dawn broke over Ocracoke Inlet, the drinking stopped. The fuses were lit. November 22nd, 1718, the morning the legend died, Maynard ordered the anchors raised. Because the wind had died down, they had to use long oars to manually row the Jane and the Ranger toward the pirate ship. It was agonizingly slow. Every pull of the oars brought them closer to the massive muzzles of Blackbeard's cannons. Blackbeard stood on the deck of the Adventure, watching the Navy men row toward him. He ordered his men to cut the anchor cable. The Adventure began to move, maneuvering to bring its heavy side cannons to bear. As the ships closed the distance, Blackbeard stepped to the rail. His booming voice carried over the water. "Damn you for villains! Who are you? And from whence came you?" Maynard stood tall on the bow of his tiny, unarmored sloop, perfectly calm. He shouted back, "You may see by our colors we are no pirates." Blackbeard raised a glass of liquor, downed it, and roared his final curse. "Damnation seize my soul if I give you quarters, or take any from you." The Adventure unleashed a devastating broadside. Remember, Maynard had no heavy guns to fire back. He was sailing right into the teeth of a monster. Blackbeard's cannons were loaded with scrap metal, nails, and iron balls. The volley tore through the British sloops. On the Ranger, the commander was killed instantly, along with several of his men. The ship was completely disabled, drifting out of the fight. On Maynard's ship, the Jane, the deck was turned into a slaughterhouse. In a single volley, Maynard lost nearly a third of his crew. Blackbeard's strategy was working perfectly. He had crippled his attackers. Now, as the Jane drifted helplessly toward the Adventure, Blackbeard prepared to board her and finish the job. He ordered his men to gather at the rail with grenades, bottles filled with gunpowder and lead shot, fitted with quick matches. But Blackbeard had made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed the blood on the deck meant the battle was already won. He didn't realize that Robert Maynard was a tactical genius. As the ships collided and Blackbeard's grenades rained down, exploding in bursts of smoke and shrapnel, the deck of the Jane appeared entirely empty. It looked as though the entire Royal Navy crew was dead. Blackbeard yelled in triumph. He and 14 of his most hardened pirates swung over the rails, landing on the blood-soaked deck of the Jane, cutlasses drawn. But Maynard wasn't dead. Seconds before the collision, Maynard had ordered all of his surviving men to drop into the ship's cramped hold. They were hiding below the floorboards, muskets loaded, listening to the pirates' boots hit the deck above them. Maynard was waiting for the perfect moment. When Blackbeard was completely cut off from his ship, standing directly above them, Maynard gave the signal. The hatches flew open. A dozen Royal Navy sailors surged up from the bowels of the ship like ghosts. The trap was sprung. The hunters had become the hunted. The deck of the Jane instantly devolved into utter chaos. It was no longer a naval battle. It was a desperate, bloody street brawl on a violently rocking wooden floor. Through the thick, choking smoke of black powder, Robert Maynard locked eyes with Edward Thatch. This was it. The King's Lieutenant versus the Devil of the Atlantic. They rushed at each other. Both men drew their flintlock pistols and fired at point-blank range. Blackbeard missed. Maynard did not. His bullet struck Blackbeard squarely in the chest. For a normal man, a lead ball to the torso would be the end. But Blackbeard barely even flinched. He let out a roar, tossed the empty pistol aside, and drew his massive cutlass. Maynard drew his naval sword, and the two men clashed. The sheer physical power of the pirate was overwhelming. Blackbeard swung his heavy cutlass with the force of a hurricane. Maynard desperately parried the blows, but the pirate's strength was too much. With one brutal swing, Blackbeard snapped Maynard's sword clean in half. Maynard was disarmed. He was staring down the barrel of death. Blackbeard raised his cutlass for the killing blow. But the trap Maynard had set saved his life. He wasn't alone on that deck. Just as Blackbeard brought his sword down, one of Maynard's men, a Highlander from the Scottish regiments, lunged forward and slashed Blackbeard across the throat from behind. Blood poured from the massive pirate's neck, but remarkably, terrifyingly, he still didn't fall. Even with a bullet in his chest and a slashed throat, Blackbeard continued to fight like a wounded bear. He pulled another pistol from his bandolier, cocking it to shoot Maynard, but as he went to pull the trigger, his massive body finally gave out. The legend collapsed onto the blood-stained deck. Edward Thatch was dead. When the battle was over, the surviving pirates surrendered. Maynard's men examined Blackbeard's body. What they found was a testament to the sheer, terrifying vitality of the man. According to Maynard's own official report, Blackbeard had been shot no less than 5 times and had been stabbed or slashed more than 20 times before he finally died. The battle was won, but Robert Maynard needed to send a message to the rest of the world. He needed to prove that the invincible demon of the Atlantic was just a man. Maynard ordered his men to sever Blackbeard's head. They threw his massive, mutilated body into the freezing waters of Ocracoke Inlet. According to local legend, the headless body swam 3 circles around the ship before finally sinking to the dark bottom. Maynard took the severed head, with its infamous braids and ribbons, and suspended it from the bowsprit of his tiny sloop. He then sailed back to Virginia, the dead eyes of the world's most famous pirate staring out over the waves, announcing to everyone who saw it that the golden age of piracy was effectively over. Lieutenant Robert Maynard accomplished what the entire British Empire had struggled to do. He used strategy, patience, and nerves of steel to defeat a man who had paralyzed global trade routes. But history is a funny thing. We remember the villains. We make movies about the pirates. We romanticize the outlaws. Today, everyone knows the name Blackbeard. There are statues of him, amusement park rides, and blockbuster movies. But almost no one knows the name Robert Maynard. He never received a massive promotion. He wasn't knighted. He lived out his days in the Royal Navy, doing his job quietly, and eventually passed away in 1751, a relatively obscure figure. But without him, the legend of Blackbeard might have never ended. Maynard didn't need a 40-gun warship. He didn't need a pirate's flair for the theatrical. He just needed a wooden boat, a clever trap, and the courage to look the devil in the eye and hold his ground. Thank you for watching. If you want to see more untold stories from the darkest corners of history, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.